Hi, BookTube, it's Amy, and I'm back again reading from the Anatomy of Bibliomania by Holbrook Jackson. We're on page 228 today with a section titled The Twilight of the Bibliophile. The passion for books continues and even increases to the end. Anthony Trollope looked for happiness in his closing years, first to his work, then to the love of those who loved him, and then to his books. Quoting from his autobiography in the World Classics edition. But many bibliophiles, when the shadows draw out, find consolation in books alone. As the years go by, I value books more and more, said Henry Jackson. But as they grow older, they roam less and less from one book to another. For the books we plan to read in our old age are something like the places where we should wish to grow old. Come, cried George Gissing, towards the close of his life. Once more, before I die, I will read Don Quixote. Montaigne confessed that this old and heavy-paced mind of mine will no more be pleased with Aristotle or tickled with good Ovid. The quaint interventions which ravished him in the past now scarcely entertain him. But he turns to Virgil, Lucretius, Catullus, and Horace again with joy. Charles Lamb thanks Payne Collier for the gift of a fine copy of the Decameron, which came just as he was wanting something of the sort, and he confesses that he takes less pleasure in his books than heretofore, preferring books about books. Dr. Johnson's ardour for literature never failed. In his 74th year, he read all Virgil through and was reading and discussing Homer as well. Walter Savage Landor, on the eve of his 83rd year, reads little, chiefly Punch and the Household Words. I want, he says, amusing ideas, not serious ones, and was thus unlike the old bachelor and Crabbe's Tales of the Hall. My books were changed. I now preferred the truth to the light reading of unsettled youth. But although novels grew tedious by choice or chance, he still had interest in wild romance. Edward Fitzgerald was faithful to his old friends, the classics of Greece and Rome, France and England, throughout his life, but when he was nigh on 60 years old, he implored Quaritch not to waste his learned catalogues on him, for he now bought nothing but Moody's second-hand memoirs, an exaggeration, as his letters to his illustrious bookseller themselves prove. As he grew still older, he sought out in books, as he told Sir Samuel Lawrence, people, places, and things which I don't and can't see. When one gets old and dry, he said, one thirsts for what is delightful rather than profound. But to the end of his life he never tired of Sir Walter Scott and Don Quixote, who with his blessed Sevigné, Crabbe, and John Weasley were his last and great hobbies. Quoting there, the footnote says, Letters to Fanny Kemble. Carlyle, when over 80, kept on reading assiduously, sometimes till past midnight, in spite of all endeavours to get him to bed. And during the spring of 1879, his 84th year, he read through all Shakespeare. Of late years, putting aside the Latin classics, says Anthony Trollope, I have found my greatest pleasure in our old English dramatists. Coventry Patmore, in his 73rd year, could no longer read consecutive thinkers on spiritual matters. They made him feel as if he were going mad, and he became impatient of all reading except novels, which he devoured eagerly, gaining from them spiritual apprehensions which were of great value to him. Benjamin Disraeli found consolation in books, and during his last few days at Hewden, he would read the history of the Venetian Republic, Lucian, Horace, and Virgil, of whom he grew more and more fond. Lord Grenville, Prime Minister of England and bibliophile, loved books all his days. A friend who used to visit him gives a picture of him in his old age, sitting summer and winter on the same sofa with his favourite book on the shelves just above his head. Roger Ascham among them, Milton always within reach. He, at any rate, in his 66th year, was clear as to the choice between literature and politics. A minister leaves him to go to his office. I would rather he was there than I, says Grenville. If I was to live my life over again, he continued, I should do very differently. Lord Rosebery gives out that Sir Robert Walpole, in his retirement, was desolate because he had never cultivated the divine solace of books. Seeing a friend reading in the library at Houghton, Walpole said, I wish I took as much delight in reading as you do. It would be the means of alleviating many tedious hours in my present retirement, but to my misfortune, I have no pleasure in such pursuits. And to Henry Fox he said, You can read. It is a great happiness. I totally neglected it when I was in business, which has been the whole of my life, and to such a degree I cannot now read a page. A warning to all ministers. Reading needs practice as much as any other art. Otherwise, the technique becomes atrophied, as taste itself may die or degenerate from all other causes. Charles Darwin, for instance, was so immersed in scientifical research that in later life he lost all pleasure in poetry of any kind, including Shakespeare. Hazlitt firmly supports early and continuous reading in his advice to a schoolboy. Reading, he says, is perhaps the greatest pleasure you will have in life, the one you will think of longest and repent of least. And if this life has been more full of calamity than it has been, he confesses he would live it all over again in order to read the books he read in his youth. But he is an exception among book lovers in one respect, for towards the end of his days, he confesses, books, in a great measure, lost their power over him. And although the reading of Mr. Keats' Eve of St. Agnes made him regret he was not young again, the beautiful and tender images there conjured up moved him no longer. They merely flitted across his fancy. The sharp, luscious flavor, the fine aroma is fled, and nothing but the stalk, the bran, the husk of literature is left. He that will know, therefore, how to use books so as to get out of them full measure of content, let him learn how the happiest readers have read at all times, how they have made books at one with their days, and thus found peace at the end. To the end I shall be reading, bragged Gissing, and he meant to the end he would be happy, but not as those who flirt with books in their youth and then abandon them, and so like grasshoppers whilst they sing over their cups all summer they starve in winter. Cicero implored Atticus not to promise his library to anyone. However passionate a wooer, for he himself was saving up, as they say, to buy the books as a prop for his old age. Macaulay never ceased to read in all his days. Towards the end he loved best to browse among his books, nibbling choice morsels as he roved. I read miscellaneous trifles from the back rows of my books, Nathan's Reminiscences of Brian, Coleman's Broad Grins, Strange's Letters to Lord Bute, Gibbon's Vindication, and his answer to Warburton from the Sixth Aeneid, Swift's Polite Conversations, and Arbuthnot's John Bull. A few weeks before his death, he read Nichol's Literary Anecdotes, a ponderous row of 9 volumes, each containing 700 or 800 closely printed pages. He searched and sifted this vast repertory of 18th century erudition and gossip with a minute diligence such as few men have the patience to bestow upon a book which they do not intend to re-edit. He read at the rate of a volume a week, finishing and annotating the entire work between the 17th day of October and the 21st of December, 1859. A week later, the greatest reader of all time was found dead, seated at the table in his library with an open book before him. Thus would all good bookmen wish to die, as soldiers in action, as men of affairs at their work, as sailors at sea, amid their appropriate surroundings, doing their work, shining to the end rather than rusting out. And if regret will not be absent, for the pain of parting with our happiness still rises in proportion to the length of its continuance, yet many a bookman has been able to make a happy ending hold in his hands a particular beloved volume. John Donne was so enamored of his books that when he observed that there was a vault under his study, he hoped to die reading, since his book and grave are so near. And our footnote says that's from a letter to Sir H.G., 1608. And so happily have many of them passed in the midst of that life, which was their sole passion. The world of books, lying dead among thy books, the peace of God in all thy looks. Giovanni Lamy, the great Italian librarian and collector, whose memory is still preserved in the Greek collection which he gave to the University of Florence, spent his life among books and died with a manuscript in his arms. Our footnote pointing us to The Great Book Collectors by Elton. And so died Magliabechi in his old cane chair, book in hand, books around him. Grolier, the prince of book collectors, died as he would have wished, surrounded by his books, in his most elegant mansion in the Rue de Bussy, Paris. Petrarch died alone in his library at Acre, his head resting on an open book, the manuscript of his Life of Caesar, unfinished before him, as Plato is said to have died long before, with his head on Sophron's jests. Fenton, the poet, died in 1730, at Lady Trumbull's house at East Hampstead, among his books and papers. Leibnitz died in a chair with the Argynnis of Barclay in his hands. When Sir William Ulcer was near his end, he asked to have Milton's Nativity read to him from his precious first edition. Francis Thompson's final companions were Jacob's Many Cargoes and a prayer book. Henry Bradshaw, our great bibliographer, was found dead by his servant in his room at Cambridge, sitting at his table with a little Irish book in front of him. Leigh Hunt lived for books, and like John Donne, prayed to die among them. If fortune turns her face once more in kindness upon me before I go, I may chance some quiet day to lay my overbeating temples on a book, and so have the death I most envy. From the footnote says, my books, essays in the Camelot edition. Père Jacob, in his treatise on famous libraries, tells of his journey to Ferrara, where he visited the tomb of Coelius, who was buried among his books at his own desire, not, as he says, like a miser in the midst of his riches, but like a lover among the treasures of his heart. And methinks 'tis not altogether unfit that when these true lovers depart this life, they should thus pass away among the dear creations of the brain, confident, belike that they will take up their joy, renew their old companionships. For as the poet sings, "Oh, then the bliss of blisses to be freed from all the wants by which the world is driven, with liberty and endless time to read the libraries of heaven." And that brings us to the end of that section. And well, I think it wouldn't be too bad to pass away surrounded by your books. I wouldn't want to be buried with books because that would essentially end the lifespan of those books along with me. Books should be passed on to other readers. But that's kind of an interesting question that this section raises. You know, in your old age, which books would you most like to be surrounded with? At this point in my life, I would think it would be quite nice to be constantly rereading the letters of Madame de Sévigné, perhaps Boswell's Life of Johnson, and of course the wonderful works of A. Edward Newton, and perhaps even, if the mind could handle it, Holbrook Jackson's Anatomy of Bibliomania would be a nice companion in old age. But let me know in the comments below if you've made it this far in the video, if you're still tuned in here and listening, what books you imagine yourself reading and rereading again in your old age. But we'll end it here for today.